All right, this is note 7.1. We will be going over a very important concept in biology, referred to as alleles, and this is in the study of genetics. Okay, so genetics is the study of how characteristics are passed on from parent to offspring. You may have noticed that if you look at any biological family, the biological children are going to look similar in certain ways to their parents. Their parents might have various traits and characteristics that get passed on. And so in this unit, we're going to look at how do offspring, or how do children, or even we'll look at things like puppies and kittens, and how do the offspring decide how to express that mixture of traits and of characteristics that get passed on from their parents. Okay. Now, the studies of genetics was really pioneered and promoted by this guy named Gregor Mendel. So we're going to spell his name like this, Gregor Mendel. I actually had a professor in college whose name was Dr. Mendel, and he named his son Greg after this guy. It's kind of funny. This guy lived in the 1800s. He was an Austrian monk, so he was born in the country not too far from us. And he performed these really famous experiments on pea plants. And we'll talk more about that at the end of these notes and in the next unit as well. But he actually did all of these experiments on how peas passed on these characteristics, just like the peas that you'd eat. Okay, they're growing on plants, and so he, in his garden, which you can see him holding some pea plants here, he started studying how these different traits would be passed on from offspring, from parent to offspring. And this led to a lot of discoveries and helped our understanding of how traits are passed on. Now, he actually didn't publish his results they weren't very popular, but it was later in the 1900s that people rediscovered all the work that he had done, and they discovered, oh, this is really significant. Actually, this tells us a lot about how not only peas pass on their traits, but also in animals, in other organisms as well. And so a lot of how humans pass on traits down to each other is going to be determined by some of the same principles that Gregor Mendel discovered with his pea plants. All right, and we'll talk about more with him later, but this comes down to a basic fact, and that is for every gene that you have two versions, okay? And this one version came from the father, and one version came from the mother. One version came from the father, and actually, let's change the color here. One version came from the mother. Okay? Just like when you look at a chromosome pair, like we talked about in the last unit, you had one chromosome came from the father and one chromosome came from the mother. Those chromosomes, okay, remember a chromosome might be shaped something like this. Let's see if it appears there. Okay, so you have this chromosome, and inside of that chromosome you have a gene here, 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 a gene here. Okay, so you've got all those genes on there. So your maternal chromosome contains all the genes from your mother, and your paternal one contains the one from the father, and you have 23 of those pairs. So, for instance, if we were to look inside of the nucleus of any of your cells, we would find chromosome pair 15. Okay, it's the 15th chromosome, and you have one version that came from your mother and one version that came from your father. Now, on that chromosome 15, you have a gene that helps determine what color eyes you have. Okay, there are some other genes that also influence your eye color, but this is the main one. And both the maternal and the paternal have their own versions of this gene. Now, those versions might be the same or they might be different. Okay? So, for instance, one person might have a brown-eyed version and another person might have a blue-eyed version. These are two different versions of the same gene. Okay? Just like you might have the same car as someone, but maybe yours is red and your friend's is blue. Or maybe you have the same recipe for cookies, but one person has chocolate chips and the other person has raisins. I'll let you decide which is the correct one. All right, so they're both kind of similar, but they have different versions of the same thing. Okay? Now, to get kind of just an overview of why we have multiple versions, we can think back thousands of years ago. And there was someone probably in Europe, because that's where we find most blue eyes. Somebody was born with a substitution mutation. So remember, that's a mutation where one letter in the DNA code is changed and swapped out with another letter. All right, and there was this one spot along the gene that had, I think, we're going millions of base pairs into the gene. Okay, we see into the chromosome. We see there's an adenine somewhere. And there was a mutation, and instead of having an adenine, there was a guanine. Okay, so substitution. What that actually did was that changed the gene so much that it actually changed how the eye illustrates color or demonstrates color. And so you just change that one letter in the DNA code, and you go from having a brown eye to having a light-colored eye, such as blue or gray or green. Okay, now inside of my cells, and I did this through DNA testing, so I know this is the case, but on my maternal chromosome 15 and my paternal chromosome 15, I have a guanine at this spot. Okay, so they tested it in the lab and they found out that I have a G at this spot in that DNA code. Now that causes me to have lighter eyes. I have kind of grayish blue eyes, and the reason is because of that DNA code. If you have brown eyes, you probably still have an adenine at that spot. All right, so we have two versions of the same gene. One version gives you brown eyes, and another version gives you lighter eyes like blue. Okay, and this is a really important word here, version. And we actually have a word that we use in biology to describe a version of a gene, and that is allele. Okay, say allele. Allele. An allele is simply a version of a gene, okay? If we use this in everyday language, you could say, my car is the red allele. It's the red version, whereas somebody else might have the black allele. It's the black version of the car. Or a white allele, so it's the white version, or a gray version, okay? There's different versions of the same thing. So in biology, we just use the word allele. So anytime I say version, you can just swap that with the word allele. Okay, so an allele of the color gene, you might have a blue allele or a brown allele. Now, there's something else that we use in life that has multiple versions. It actually has two versions, and that is letters of the alphabet. Okay, so for instance, if I look at A, I could have a capital version, or I could have a lowercase version. Or if I look at B, I could have a capital version or a lowercase version. They're the same letter. A is still A, B is still B, but they are different versions. Now that makes that really handy because we can actually use this concept in biology, because just like you might have one gene with two versions, we can have one letter with two versions. So we actually use letters to represent genes or alleles. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the letter E or E to represent versions of the eye color gene, simply because I starts with an E. All right, so we're going to use E or E. Let's take a look here. Okay, here's an actual image of what a chromosome 15 looks like. So if you were to look under a super powerful microscope inside of the nucleus of one of your cells, you could see this chromosome 15. And right here, we have the gene for eye color. Okay, so let's suppose that this is, let's give this an E right here, and let's give this an E. Okay, now what does that mean? That means that I have the same version on both the maternal and the paternal. Okay, so my genotype is actually EE. So that means this person, they got the same version from the father, and they got the same version from the mother. Okay, what that actually looks like is this person has brown eyes. So we're just going to say that the capital letter represents the brown-eyed version. Okay, so capital, we'll do E represents brown version, or brown allele. And we're going to do lowercase e is the blue allele. Lowercase e is the blue allele. Okay? So you have this person has 2 copies, and he has 2 brown versions, so he's going to have brown eyes. Okay? Now if I look at my chromosomes over here, I have the other version of the same gene. I'm going to put lowercase. Okay? So on my maternal chromosome, I have the blue-eyed version. And on my paternal chromosome, I also have my blue-eyed version. So I'd simply say my genotype is EE for eye color. And guess what? I have bluish eyes. So I'm going to say blue or light-colored eyes. Which makes sense, right? If I have 2 recipes and they're both exactly the same, I'm just going to read both of them and I'm going to end up having blue eyes because both of them are the same version. Okay, and this is the same for all of these. So here's the maternal, here's the paternal chromosome, maternal, actually let's label this maternal chromosome, and here's my paternal one. Okay, let's look at the middle one here. What if I have a capital letter here and a lowercase letter here? So basically, what if the mother passes on a brown-eyed version and the father has blue eyes, and so the father passes on the blue-eyed version? What is the child going to have? The mother has the brown eyes, the father has the blue eyes. So the genotype here is EE. And here's where one of the main lessons that we're going to learn today comes from. This person is actually going to have brown eyes. So if the mother passes on a brown eye version or allele, and the father passes on a blue-eyed version, the child is still going to have brown eyes. That's a little weird. Why is that? Well, we will talk about that in a moment here. First off, I just want to define these terms over here. Phenotype, that means the physical thing that's happening, and genotype means what's happening inside of the genes. Okay, so these letters are just representing versions of genes that I have. Okay. So, what if I have a dark-eyed and a light-eyed version? Just like I have here. Dark-eyed, light-eyed. Brown-eye, blue-eye. Okay? What actually happens is we have this thing called a dominant allele. When you think dominant, you can kind of think of dominating. Okay? Dominating means that you're overpowering something, right? The dominant allele always covers up a recessive allele. Okay, you can kind of think recess, like recess is when you take a break from what you're supposed to be doing in school, or a recession is when maybe the economy is tanking, like it very well might in the next couple months. So dominant and recessive are these words that we use. All right, when we think of a capital letter, do you think that's dominant or recessive? It's actually dominant. So in the human genome, sorry, let's spell dominant. Dominant, that's an N. In the human genome, brown eyes always takes precedent over blue eyes, or dark eyes take precedent over light eyes. Okay, so if I just have one dominant allele, then you're probably going to have those dark eyes. Okay, the cell's going to read the dominant allele anytime it has it. The cell will read the recessive gene only if there's no dominant one to read. Okay, so for instance, up here, when I see EE, all right, capital E, those are two dominants. So that person has no choice. They have to read the dark eye and the dark eye. Okay, remember the brown or dark colored is the capital. If I see a capital and a lowercase, which one am I going to choose to read? I always choose to read this one. Read that one. So you'll always be able to, I'll either tell you or you'll figure out which is the dominant one. Here, in this case, there are no capital letters, so you just have to resort to doing the lowercase one. Which is why, if you have light eyes, you probably have just two copies of those from your parents. Now, there are some other reasons why eye color is a little more complicated, so like if you have a brown-eyed parent and you have blue eyes, don't freak out. It's not like that. There's other genes that might affect the color, but this is just kind of a simple explanation here. Okay, so the dominant alleles we always represent by capital letters. Capital letters. And the recessive alleles we always represent by lowercase letters. And if you have two of the same versions, we have the word called homozygous. Okay? And if you have two different versions, we have a word called heterozygous that we use to describe that. Okay? Homo referring to same and hetero referring to different. Zygous just kind of has to do with the word offspring or genetic information in the offspring. So notice how person 1 here, they have two of the same versions, and it's the dominant version. So we actually say that this person is homozygous dominant. Now I know these are a lot of terms, but you'll get a chance to practice these on the homework. And these are terms that people in genetics and breeding use all the time. So these aren't just fancy biology words. People do use them often when talking about characteristics. Okay. Here, this person, do they have the same versions or different versions? They have different versions. So we just simply need to say heterozygous. Now, do we need to say dominant or recessive? No, because we just know that they are both, they have a dominant and a recessive, and they're just going to read this one. They're just going to read the brown-eyed allele. Okay? For me here, my chromosome 15 gene would be considered homozygous recessive because I have two of the same recessive alleles. Homozygous recessive. So I am homozygous recessive for eye color, which is why I have blue eyes. Okay? Now, the word genotype, another vocabulary word here, that's just the word that we use to describe the conditions of the genes. So anytime that I'm talking about things on the genetic level inside of the chromosomes, I'm referring to genotype. You can just use geno to remember that. Let's see, genotype, genes. The word phenotype is what actually occurs. Pheno sounds kind of like physical, PH, okay? So for instance, a genotype might be something like AA or BB, different alleles, okay? Phenotype might be things like, oh, this bird has blue eggs or black feathers Or maybe this person has curly hair. Or maybe they have red hair. All right, so all of those things are physical things that are determined by the genotype. Your genes determine what you physically look like. All right, let's look at some examples back with Mendel. Gregor Mendel, who was the guy who did the experiments with the pea plants, okay, he really did not know about genes coding for proteins or even the chromosomes that package up those genes, but he did discover that there are certain versions of characteristics that are always covered up by other versions. So the dominant and recessive stuff, he discovered that. And he kept track of how these traits were passed on from the parent pea plants to the offspring. Okay, so here's a picture of a pea plant. This is what they look like. This is what peas, you know, if you ever have vegetable peas for dinner, okay, they come from plants that look like this. Okay, and when we look at a flower, okay, the sperm are produced in structures like this, and the egg is produced below the flower. So those two things are going to combine. And we can always, basically what Gregor Mendel did was he took the sperm from one flower and put it with the egg of another flower, and then looked to see what pea plant would be produced from the pea that sprouted. Okay, so over here we're going to look at our male sperm from the pea plant, and we're going to look at what happens when he combined it with an egg, or when he fertilized it through pollination with a different pea plant, and look at the baby that it had. The baby pea. The offspring that it had, okay? All right, so when we looked, he had some plants that were tall, he had some plants that were short, and they stayed that short. They didn't grow any taller. They were dwarfs, okay? And so he determined that that was a characteristic of different peas that he had. So he said, all right, let's look at this tall allele. Let's assign the letter A to that, okay? What happened was when he pollinated a short plant with a tall plant, the offspring was tall. Well, what does that tell you? That tells me that the plant prefers to read the tall allele. So the tall is dominant. Even though this plant has the short allele from the egg, the maternal short allele, it doesn't read it. It doesn't want to. It wants to read the tall one, and so the tall one is dominant. So that means my short is recessive. Oh, okay. So I'm going to do this with a lowercase letter. So tall is dominant, lowercase is recessive, and these are being carried by, this is being carried by the sperm, this is being carried by the egg, and the offspring is diploid, so it has two of those things. Remember, the sperm is haploid, so it only carries half of the information, and then that combines to create this, okay? So capital A, lowercase a, that's our genotype of this plant. And it prefers to read the A, okay? You know, I'm going to change my colors here because haploid sperm, we're going to use blue to represent the father. So I'm going to change this to a blue A. And, whoops. Will it erase? We'll see. Yep. And this to a blue A. So in this case, the father, okay, I'm just going to use father and mother even though we don't really use those terms typically with plants. The father pea, the father pea plant passed on this blue, and so because it was capital, it expressed that. So that's why it was tall. Let's look down here at this one. He took a plant that had a purple flower and he pollinated a white flower with that, and the offspring that was produced from that produced another plant that grew up and had a purple flower. So what does that tell you? That means that being purple, having purple flowers, that's a dominant trait. So anytime that a pea plant has that purple version in its genotype, it's going to read it. Now, because purple's dominant, that means I'm going to assign a capital letter. Here, white is recessive, so I'm going to do a lowercase. White is the recessive trait. So basically, a pea plant will only have white flowers if it has no purple genes. Notice this plant has the white gene, but it's not going to read it. It's stuck there on its maternal chromosome and it's recessive. The blue paternal dominant allele is going to overpower that little a, and it's just going to read the purple. All right, let's look at these pods. These are the seed pods. So peas are found inside of a pod. Okay. And there was a certain trait that he noticed where some of the pods were really round and then others were wrinkled and they were kind of constricted around the peas. So you could kind of see this shape here. So one was really nice and smooth. The other pods were really bumpy. Well, when he pollinated the round pod with with the plant that had the wrinkled pod, the result was the offspring had round. So what does that tell you? That tells you that having round pods is dominant. So if a plant can have round pods, it will. But if it only has the wrinkled allele, then it will be wrinkled. Okay? So let's say this is lowercase and this is capital. So I have... Sorry, I'm using A's, but I shouldn't. Okay, we're going to use D's, different letters. I'm sorry, let's go back here. D. We're going to use different letters for these alleles. And then up here, I should have said B. 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 Alright, so we're always reading the capital version. Alright, if we look at the pod color, that's a bit different, okay? You'll notice this one was yellow, and when he crossed the yellow plant with the green pod, the offspring ended up having green pods. Well, what does that tell you? That means it was reading the green allele over the yellow one, which means green is dominant. Okay, so now we're switching it up here. Now the mother had a dominant one. So we're going to say the green allele, let's do a capital E. Remember, we can just kind of arbitrarily choose a letter. And this one, the yellow, got covered up. So my genotype here, I'm still just going to do capital first and lowercase second. Okay, so I chose to be, the pod chose to be green, the offspring did, because the green is dominant to the yellow. So the green gene kind of overpowered the yellow one. Now if we look down at the seed level, the peas inside of the pod, we had wrinkled peas and we had round peas. So when he took a plant that had wrinkled peas and he crossed that with a plant that had round peas, what was the shape of the offspring? Well, they had round peas. So because of that, that tells you that round is dominant. Okay, so I'm going to use G here. So I'm going to say round. And then here, this was lowercase because the wrinkle got covered up. So here, round is capital G and this G, so it'll be consistent. Okay. So this is the offspring. The offspring has the round allele from its mother and the wrinkled allele from its father. But because we notice the round is dominant, it is going to read that gene and it's going to be round itself. Let's look at the colors. So this is a different gene that determines the color of the pea. Okay, so the peas, some were yellow, some were green, and when he pollinated those two plants together, then the offspring had yellow peas. So what does that tell you? That means the offspring preferred to read the yellow allele, or the yellow version, over the green version. So that means yellow is dominant. If it has the yellow copy, it's going to read it. Okay, so yellow allele is, let's do a capital letter, and then the green allele is lowercase. So our genotype is yellow. It chose to read that capital, or that dominant allele, that dominant version of the gene. Okay? So these are some of the traits that Mendel noticed, and that's how he discovered that sometimes offspring wants to read certain versions over other versions. And so he used the words dominant and recessive to figure that out. Let's look at a review. Okay, what's the dominant flower color? If we look back up here, we can see that the dominant flower color, well, it was purple. Because the offspring had both the purple and the white versions in its genome, but it chose to read the purple one. So we know that the purple allele is dominant. What's the recessive seed shape? The recessive one is the wrinkled. Because you'll notice the offspring was not wrinkled. It preferred to read the round version from its mother than it preferred to read that over the wrinkled version from its father. So it's going to be wrinkled is recessive. Now, if we want to find out what the genotype is for the offspring, for all of the traits that we just looked at, all we have to do is add up these letters. Okay? So we could just say A, B, B, capitals, sorry, we did not go to C, we only did D. Capital D, lowercase d, capital E, lowercase e, capital G, lowercase g, capital H, lowercase h. So that comes from up here. You notice I'm not doing C because capital C and lowercase c look the same. Same with F for when I write it, and so I don't do letters that look the same if they're capital and lowercase. Okay? You'll notice that each of these things are what we would call heterozygous. They have two different versions from their two parents. Let's say that you came across a pea plant and you knew it had this genotype. What would be its phenotype? Well, we have two capital A's. And we know that capital A means dominant. So what does capital A represent? If we look back up here, the dominant one was tall. So it can only read the tall gene. So this was a tall pea plant. Okay, let's change our color here. If I look at BB, lowercase b, well, what was the B trait? That was flower color. And the recessive was white. Do I have a purple version I can read? No, I only have the recessive. So because of that, it's homozygous recessive. I can only be white. I don't have any purple versions to read here. Let's look at capital D, lowercase d. Another heterozygous. All right, here it has both the round version and the wrinkled version to read. What is it going to choose to read? It's going to choose to read the round version on its paternal chromosome. Okay, so it's going to be round pods. Sorry, let's change the white flower. Okay, if we look at lowercase e, lowercase e. What is the E trait? The E trait was yellow versus green. Well, if we have lowercase, that means the offspring only has the recessive version to read. So it has to read it. There's no dominant available. So what is the recessive? It's yellow. So it's going to have yellow pods. Okay. Lowercase g. What was the G trait? Wrinkled versus round. So lowercase was wrinkled P. So that means if this only has 2 recessive versions, it can only read those. So it's going to be a wrinkled P. If we look at HH, capital H, lowercase h, all right, that's just like what it's going to be up here. It's going to choose to read the dominant version. And what's the dominant? The yellow. Okay? All right, so the big takeaway, a gene can have different versions. Okay? You will have 2 versions because you always have a chromosome from the mother and a chromosome from the biological father. Whoops, that should be blue. Okay? So you have different versions of the same gene, like blue or brown, or maybe yellow or green. An organism will always read the dominant version over the recessive version. So whichever one is dominant is going to overpower the recessive. There's a lot of different reasons why it might be dominant or recessive. We won't necessarily get into those. Now, what you need to know, you don't need to memorize these. Like, you don't need to memorize that yellow is recessive and green is dominant. But you should be able to do something like this where you figure out what is the dominant allele based off of the offspring, or even predict what the offspring is going to be if I tell you which one's dominant and recessive. So it's those skills of figuring out what the offspring will look like. Okay, so two parents might have different versions or different traits, but depending on which one's dominant and recessive, that's going to determine how the child or the offspring is going to read that. Okay, so there's our introduction to genetics. For our next theme, for next week, we will talk about how you can determine what the grandkids will look like. But for now, we're just doing the first generation. If you have questions, email me or video call me, and we can walk through some of this. We'll also have a video session to go over some of this. Homework will be uploaded tomorrow. Thank you.